When Thelonious Monk told Miles Davis, "You don't understand my music," he was delivering what might be the ultimate insult one jazz musician could give another. To tell Miles Davis, already recognized as one of the most innovative minds in jazz, that he lacked musical understanding was like telling Einstein he didn't understand physics. But Miles's response didn't just defend his musical intelligence. It became one of the most quoted exchanges in jazz history and revealed something profound about genius, respect, and the courage to be misunderstood. It was a humid evening in July 1957 at the Five Spot Cafe in New York's East Village, and the jazz world was buzzing with anticipation. Thelonious Monk, the eccentric piano genius, whose angular compositions and unpredictable performance style had made him one of the most enigmatic figures in jazz, was in the middle of a legendary residency that was drawing musicians and fans from across the city. Miles Davis, 31 years old and already established as one of the most important voices in modern jazz, had come to the Five Spot not as a performer but as a listener. He was curious about what Monk was doing, intrigued by the reports of the pianist's innovative approach to harmony and rhythm that seemed to challenge every convention of traditional jazz. The relationship between Miles and Monk was complicated. They represented two completely different approaches to musical innovation. Miles was cool, controlled, and minimalist in his approach. He had built his reputation on what he didn't play as much as what he did. Every note was carefully chosen, every phrase precisely crafted, every silence deliberately placed. Monk, on the other hand, was angular, unpredictable, and maximalist in his complexity. His compositions were filled with dissonant harmonies, unexpected chord changes, and rhythmic patterns that seemed to fight against themselves before resolving in ways that surprised even experienced musicians. Where Miles was smooth and accessible, Monk was jagged and challenging. As Miles sat in the dimly lit club, nursing a drink and watching Monk perform, he found himself both fascinated and frustrated by what he was hearing. Monk's music was undeniably innovative, but it seemed to go against everything Miles believed about effective musical communication. Miles had always believed that the best music was music that reached people, that moved them emotionally without requiring a degree in music theory to appreciate. His approach was built on the idea that sophistication didn't have to mean inaccessibility, that the most profound musical statements could be made with remarkable simplicity. But Monk's music seemed designed to challenge the listener, to force them to work for their understanding rather than offering immediate emotional gratification. His compositions were like puzzles that revealed their beauty only to those willing to invest the time and effort to solve them. During a break between sets, Miles found himself backstage in the cramped area behind the Five Spot's small performance space. Monk was there, sitting at an old upright piano, working out some complex harmonic ideas that sounded even more challenging in the acoustic environment than they had through the club's sound system. "Monk," Miles said, approaching the piano with the kind of casual confidence that had made him a respected figure among his peers. "I've been listening to your music, and I have to ask you something." Monk looked up from the piano keys, his intense eyes focusing on Miles with the kind of attention that made people slightly uncomfortable. Monk had a way of looking at people as if he was seeing something about them that they didn't know themselves. "What's that, Miles?" Monk asked, his voice carrying that distinctive combination of gentleness and authority that characterized his speaking voice. Miles sat down on a chair near the piano, preparing to engage in the kind of musical discussion that happened regularly among jazz musicians, an exploration of ideas, techniques, and philosophies that helped artists understand each other's work. "Your compositions," Miles began, "they're incredibly complex. The harmonic progressions, the rhythmic patterns, they're like nothing anyone else is doing. But I have to be honest with you, sometimes I feel like the complexity is getting in the way of the music itself." Miles paused, trying to find the right words to express his perspective without seeming dismissive of Monk's obvious talent. "What I mean is, I believe the best music communicates directly with people. It moves them emotionally before they have time to analyze it intellectually. But your music seems to require so much analysis that it might be losing some of its emotional impact." Monk listened to Miles's critique without interruption, his fingers absently playing soft, complex chord progressions as he processed what he was hearing. When Miles finished speaking, Monk was quiet for several long moments, continuing to play those intricate harmonies that seemed to exist in a musical language all their own. Finally, Monk stopped playing and looked directly at Miles with those penetrating eyes. "Miles," Monk said quietly, his voice carrying no anger but an unmistakable certainty, "you don't understand my music." The words hit Miles like a physical blow. In his entire career, no musician had ever told him that he lacked understanding of their work. Miles had built his reputation not just on his playing ability, but on his sophisticated musical intelligence, his ability to grasp complex harmonic concepts and innovative approaches to improvisation. To be told by another musician, even one as respected as Monk, that he didn't understand the music was perhaps the most insulting thing that could be said to any serious jazz artist. It was a challenge to his musical credibility, his artistic intelligence, and his standing among his peers. Miles felt his jaw tighten and his eyes narrow behind his dark sunglasses. For a moment, he considered responding with anger, defending his musical credentials, listing his achievements and innovations to prove that he was certainly capable of understanding any musician's work. But something about Monk's calm certainty, the complete absence of malice in his voice, made Miles pause and think more carefully about what had just happened. Instead of responding defensively, Miles removed his sunglasses and looked directly at Monk. "Explain that to me," Miles said quietly. Monk smiled slightly, a rare expression from a man known for his serious demeanor. "You're listening to my music the way you listen to everyone else's music," Monk said, his fingers returning to the piano keys. "You're looking for the melody, the harmony, the rhythm that you recognize. But that's not where my music lives." Monk began playing a composition that Miles recognized but had never heard performed this way. The familiar melody was there, but it was surrounded by harmonic colors and rhythmic patterns that transformed it into something entirely different. "Miles, you play music that talks to people in a language they already understand," Monk continued as he played. "You take familiar musical ideas and perfect them, make them more beautiful, more expressive. That's a gift. And it's why people connect with your music so immediately." Monk transitioned into another composition, this one even more angular and complex than the first. "But I'm trying to create a new language entirely. I'm not perfecting existing musical ideas. I'm inventing new ways for music to exist, and new languages always sound wrong to people who only speak the old ones." Miles found himself listening to Monk's playing with completely different ears. Instead of trying to find the familiar patterns and progressions he was accustomed to hearing, he began to listen for the internal logic of Monk's musical language. "You said my complexity gets in the way of emotional communication," Monk said, his playing becoming even more intricate. "But what if complexity is the emotion? What if the feeling I'm trying to express can only be communicated through harmonic relationships that don't exist in simpler music?" As Monk continued to play and explain, Miles began to understand something fundamental about artistic communication that he had never considered before. He had always assumed that the most effective music was music that reached the largest number of people with the least resistance. But Monk was suggesting that some artistic truths could only be expressed through approaches that required more effort from both the artist and the audience. "Monk," Miles said, his voice carrying a new respect, "you're not just writing music that's different from everyone else's. You're writing music that requires a different way of listening." "Now you're getting somewhere," Monk replied, his playing becoming even more adventurous. Miles sat in silence for several minutes, listening to Monk explore harmonic territories that he had never imagined possible. But now, instead of hearing chaos or unnecessary complexity, he was beginning to hear the emotional logic behind Monk's musical choices. "The thing is," Miles said finally, "I still believe in the power of simplicity. I still think the most profound statements can be made with the fewest notes. But I'm starting to understand that your complexity isn't the opposite of my simplicity. It's just a different path to the same goal." Monk nodded, his playing softening into something more melodically accessible while maintaining its harmonic sophistication. "Miles, the music needs both approaches. It needs your clarity and my complexity. It needs your accessibility and my challenges. Music that only goes in one direction stops growing." Miles realized that Monk wasn't just defending his own artistic choices. He was articulating a philosophy about artistic diversity that applied to all creative endeavors. "When you told me I didn't understand your music," Miles said, "you weren't insulting me. You were telling me I was listening wrong." "Exactly," Monk replied. "And the beautiful thing is, now that you know you were listening wrong, you can learn to listen right. Understanding isn't something you either have or don't have. It's something you develop." Miles stood up and walked to the piano, placing his hands on the keys next to Monk's. "Show me," Miles said simply. What followed was one of the most extraordinary musical conversations in jazz history. For the next hour, Monk guided Miles through the harmonic and rhythmic concepts that formed the foundation of his compositional approach, not trying to convince Miles to abandon his own musical philosophy, but helping him understand how a completely different approach could achieve equally valid artistic goals. Miles played some of his own compositions, but tried to hear them through the filter of what Monk had been teaching him. Monk played some of his most complex pieces, but helped Miles identify the emotional content that drove their harmonic sophistication. By the end of their conversation, neither musician had changed his fundamental approach to music. Miles remained committed to his minimalist, emotionally direct style. Monk continued to pursue his complex, intellectually challenging compositions, but both had gained something invaluable, a deeper understanding of how great music could take completely different forms while serving the same essential purpose of human expression and communication. When Monk returned to the stage for his second set that night, Miles remained in the audience, but he was listening with completely different ears. No longer trying to translate Monk's musical language into his own, but learning to appreciate the beauty and logic of an entirely different approach to artistic expression. The exchange between Miles and Monk became legendary in jazz circles, not because of any conflict or competition, but because it demonstrated how true artists could respectfully challenge each other's understanding while ultimately deepening their mutual appreciation. Miles would later say that his conversation with Monk changed not just how he listened to other musicians, but how he thought about his own role in the continuing evolution of jazz music. "Monk taught me that being misunderstood isn't always a failure of the artist," Miles said in a 1965 interview. "Sometimes it's a failure of the audience to develop new ways of listening. But the beautiful thing is, audiences can learn, just like musicians can learn." The influence of that evening extended far beyond the personal relationship between two great musicians. Miles began incorporating some of Monk's harmonic concepts into his own compositions, not copying Monk's style, but adapting his innovations to fit Miles's own artistic vision. Monk, for his part, began to appreciate how Miles's accessibility could serve as a bridge that helped audiences develop the listening skills necessary to appreciate more challenging music. The legendary exchange also became a model for how musicians could disagree about artistic approaches while maintaining respect for each other's achievements. Instead of viewing different musical philosophies as competing for the same limited space, they demonstrated how diverse approaches could enrich the entire art form. Years later, when young musicians would ask Miles about working with difficult or eccentric artists, he would reference his conversation with Monk as an example of how apparent musical incompatibility could be transformed into mutual enrichment. When someone tells you that you don't understand their music, Miles would advise, "Don't get defensive, get curious. They might be offering you a chance to hear things you've never heard before." The lesson from that July evening in 1957 extends far beyond music. It demonstrates that true understanding often requires abandoning our existing frameworks and developing new ways of perceiving and appreciating excellence that doesn't fit familiar patterns. Miles Davis learned that night that genius comes in many forms, and that the greatest artists are those who can recognize and appreciate brilliance even when it looks nothing like their own. If this incredible story of artistic growth and mutual respect inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that true appreciation sometimes requires learning new ways of seeing and hearing. Have you ever discovered that you were experiencing something wrong, only to find it more beautiful once you learn to perceive it correctly? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out more stories about the legendary conversations that expanded the boundaries of artistic understanding.